War never changes. In the year 1945, my great-great-grandfather, serving in the army, wondered when he'd get to go home to his wife and the son he'd never seen. He got his wish when the U.S. ended World War II by dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world awaited Armageddon. Instead, something miraculous happened. We began to use atomic energy not as a weapon, but as a nearly limitless source of power. People enjoyed luxuries once thought the realm of science fiction. Domestic robots, fusion-powered cars, portable computers. But then, in the 21st century, people awoke from the American dream. Years of consumption led to shortages of every major resource. The entire world unraveled. Peace became a distant memory. It is now the year 2077. We stand on the brink of total war. And I am afraid. For myself, for my wife, for my infant son. Because if my time in the army taught me one thing, it's that war never changes.
War never changes. Since the dawn of humankind, when our ancestors first discovered the killing power of rock and bone, blood has been spilled in the name of everything from God to justice to simple psychotic rage.
War never changes. The Romans waged war to gather slaves and wealth. Spain built an empire from its lust for gold and territory. Hitler shaped a battered Germany into an economic superpower. But war never changes. In the 21st century, war was still waged over the resources that could be acquired. Only this time, the spoils of war were also its weapons: petroleum and uranium. For these resources, China would invade Alaska, the US would annex Canada, and the European Commonwealth would dissolve into quarreling, bickering nation-states bent on controlling the last remaining resources on Earth.
In the year 2077, after millennia of armed conflict, the destructive nature of man could sustain itself no longer. The world was plunged into an abyss of nuclear fire and radiation. But it was not, as some had predicted, the end of the world. Instead, the apocalypse was simply the prologue to another bloody chapter of human history. For man had succeeded in destroying the world, but war never changes.
In 2077, the storm of world war had come again. In 2 brief hours, most of the planet was reduced to cinders. And from the ashes of nuclear devastation, a new civilization would struggle to arise. A few were able to reach the relative safety of the large underground vaults.
In the early days, thousands were spared the horrors of the Holocaust by taking refuge in enormous underground shelters known as vaults. But when they emerged, they had only the hell of the wastes to greet them.
There is much to be skeptical of in this world, so it no longer surprises me to learn how many people don't really believe in anything. what's the point? For many of us, the road is a difficult one, but the path is always there for us to follow, no matter how many times we may fall. The good news is that we can help you find your way back. Naturally, some days are harder than others, but I must try. We all have doubts. The light of the mind alone cannot burn away all darkness. Think on it and look in your heart. It will be for the best. When the walls come tumbling down, when you lose everything you have, you always have family. The fire that had kept me alive was love. Their love. God's love. Right. You're not so certain. Fair enough. We all go through periods of darkness. Of course. In a world filled with misery and uncertainty, it is a great comfort to know that, in the end, there is light in the darkness. In such times we can turn to the Lord, but it's good to have friends. And the good Lord knows there's much to be done here. You're a good neighbor to us. Thank you. Until then, God be with you.
On October 23rd, 2077, the nightmares became all too real when the Great War commenced. Blinding light ignited the sky, and people ducked and took cover as they had been taught, cowering under whatever they could, hoping that if they kept their eyes closed and remained still, that the merciless flames would pass them by. They hid beneath desks at school, under cars on the street, and behind desks at work. Perhaps a few were in their beds when the flash appeared on the horizon, and perhaps they drew their blankets over their head like children, hoping that the searing pain was just a bad dream. The ballyhooed tactic of duck and cover proved ineffective against armies that no longer cared about winning. Mutually self-assured destruction was the goal, and the American and Chinese exceeded it in spades. Hundreds of millions of people lost their lives within minutes, and billions more died over the days to come as radioactive fallout settled over entire continents. The fallout muddied the oceans, clouded the sky, and sunk deep into the soil. Those who happened to be in the right place at the moment the bombs fell managed to survive. These lucky few formed the primitive tribal societies that struggled for survival in the years immediately following the war. Hidden from those tribal bands were another group of survivors, those who had been selected for Project Safehouse, 100,000 people fortunate enough to have been offered shelter inside impregnable survival shelters called vaults, created by the Vault-Tec Corporation. The first vaults opened again a few years after the war, and their inhabitants slowly spread throughout the wasteland. By now, tales of the vaults have spread from coast to coast, although not many people alive today have actually been inside one. At the height of pre-war civilization, the government and a few powerful corporations knew that an apocalypse was brewing, so they used their finest technology to create vast subterranean bunkers that could withstand a nuclear blast, a meteor impact, global flooding, or other likely disasters. The general public wasn't entirely convinced that their end was nigh. Otherwise, there would have been a greater demand for vaults. When the war started, there were only about 100 of them scattered across America, and many held less than 1,000 people they were intended to hold. Those who were smart enough or lucky enough to be inside one when the end came were protected from the devastation by airtight steel doors, thick walls of concrete, and over 200 feet of soil. The fine engineers at Vault-Tec designed their bunkers to run independently for 10 years and even more. Geothermal power, hydroponic farms for growing food, and a water purification system so efficient vault residents could fool themselves into thinking they weren't drinking their own urine. The designers made the vaults as homey as possible despite the steel-clad walls. The cafeterias were designed to look a little like roadside diners, and vault dwellers could close their eyes and imagine that they were eating a plate of Blamco mac and cheese. Shiny new medical robots tended to those who suffered from mundane illnesses and injuries, while on the surface world, billions died from radiation sickness, burns, starvation, and violence. Housing wasn't as spacious as on the surface, but there was plenty of room for several hundred people, and the vaults that held a few thousand or more could work out fair ways to share their bunks for a while. Each vault was run by a leader called the Overseer, who ran the underground community from a command center deep inside the complex. The Overseers were usually selected for their exceptional leadership skills. The vaults were comfortable enough, but after 10 years the radiation had gone down in most parts of the country, and the vault dwellers expected to head back up into the sunlight and begin rebuilding their flawed societies. Vault-Tec had prepared them for anything that might await on the surface. The vaults had all the research material that they would need to rebuild America, including the entire Library of Congress on holodisk, plus 101 recipes on how to cook rats. Those who have walked the wasteland know that the world isn't a kind place. Sometimes people think of the pre-war days as a golden age, a time when people were better to each other. But there wouldn't have been an apocalypse if that were true. No, people were cruel and callous to each other even back then, and the folks who ran Vault-Tec were no exception. We've all heard of Vault City, a paradise built by the people who emerged from Vault 8 using a pre-war device called the Garden of Eden Creation Kit. They represent what the world could have been like if only Project Safehouse had been on the up and up. Unfortunately, Vault-Tec had some ulterior motives, and vaults like Vault 8 were rare. The poor fools who weathered the fallout in Vault-Tec's nuclear shelters were the control groups in horrible experiments. Keep people nice and safe for 10 years, then open up and build a new Garden of Eden? That happened a few times out of 100 vaults. Most vaults were designed to deliberately malfunction as part of an experiment to see just how far the human mind could be pushed before it snapped. Unbeknownst to the vault dwellers, Vault-Tec and some elite factions of the government had their own shelters far away from the public vaults. These elite wanted to learn how to rebuild society by observing the inhabitants of the defective vaults. Some of the vaults were designed so that their inhabitants would be trapped in isolation for generations. Think 10 years locked in a vault is a rough trip? Try 80 or 200. There could even be people still sealed inside hidden vaults that haven't opened yet. Other vaults had experiments that only a lunatic could conceive. 1,000 men with only one woman. 1,000 women with just one man. Or even one man trapped all alone in his own vault with nothing but a crate of puppets for company. One vault even seemed like it was designed as a personal playground for a sadistic Vault-Tec employee who just wanted some poor souls to suffer forever in a virtual reality where he was a god in a world of his own making. You might be wondering if the vault dwellers ever figured out what was happening to them. Did any of them learn that their lives meant nothing to Vault-Tec, that they had become no more than lab rats in a mad experiment? Maybe the inhabitants thought that their problems were accidental supply errors. Or maybe they realized what had happened and cursed Vault-Tec with their dying breaths. Who knows if these experiments turned up any useful information for the sons of whores who devised them. But all the suffering wasn't for nothing. Many vaults did open, even if later than expected. Some of the people who emerged went on to do great things for the wasteland. Parts of what used to be the capital of this land even has fresh water thanks to some helpful vault dwellers and technology scavenged from the old vaults. Looters hoping to uncover riches and pre-war supplies should be wary of the vaults, though. Project Safehouse has brought some troubles to the wasteland, too. The super mutants, for instance, are connected to the corporation behind the vaults. Just remember, Wanderer, it isn't worth getting killed by mutants just because you heard about a stash of fancy lad snack cakes inside some old vault's pantry.